Welcome to the Yom Yerushalayim edition of Torat Rabbi Sacks, celebrating the anniversary of the unification of Jerusalem and the restoration of access to our holy sites there following the Six-Day War. The beautiful introductory track was an excerpt from the Shabbaton Choir's version of Oseh Shalom Bimromav, performed on that occasion in Jerusalem, and which can perhaps be considered as Rabbi Sacks' signature song. As we were for Yom Ha'atzmaut, we are once again at London's Finchley Synagogue, better known as Kinloss, where Rabbi Sacks attended and spoke at Yom Yerushalayim services and celebrations. Our theme this evening is Yom Yerushalayim, a sense of belonging, and we shall explore it through both text and stories that Rabbi Sacks told and participated in, with a particular focus on some of his writings during the earlier years of his chief rabbinate. It also links to ideas which we discussed in our Yom Ha'atzmaut Torat Rabbi Sacks video. Our session has been produced in conjunction with the Yom Yerushalayim Family Edition of Ceremony and Celebration, put together by Dr. Daniel Rose and the Rabbi Sacks Legacy Trust team. If you haven't done so already, I'd highly recommend downloading it from www.rabbisacks.org after this presentation and enjoying the fascinating and stimulating material that it contains. It complements what we will learn tonight. Our story begins in June 1967 and the Six-Day War. Israel appeared to be on the brink of disaster, surrounded by larger, well-armed forces. In Britain, Jews and communal organizations scrambled to provide assistance. I'm sure that some of you watching may remember that time very well. A massive rally of 10,000 people took place at the Royal Albert Hall in London, when the newly installed Chief Rabbi, Dr. Emanuel Jacobowitz, gave a remarkable speech and call to action. You can find it in Meir Persov's book, Emanuel Jacobowitz, A Prophet in Israel, and it's reproduced in the From Exile to Redemption Machzor, published by Koren and the United Synagogue to commemorate Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaAtzmaut, and Yom Yerushalayim. That speech is highly recommended reading for Yom Yerushalayim. Although later to succeed Rabbi Jacobowitz in 1991, Rabbi Sacks at that time in 1967 was just 19 and a student at Cambridge University. In Radical Then, Radical Now, published first in 2001, here's a copy of the original edition, Rabbi Sacks describes his experience during the Six-Day War. This is also reproduced in the From Exile to Redemption Machzor. I'll share some extracts with you to give you an idea of what he was going through at that time and experience that he was having. A catastrophe seemed to be in the making. We suddenly became aware that a second tragedy might be about to overtake the Jewish people. It was then that an extraordinary thing began to happen. Throughout the university, Jews suddenly became visible. Day after day, they crowded into the little synagogue in the center of the town. Students and dons who had never before publicly identified as Jews could be found there praying. Others began collecting money. Everyone wanted to help in some way to express their solidarity, their identification with Israel's fate. It was some time before we realized that the same phenomenon was repeating itself throughout the world. From the United States to the Soviet Union, Jews were riveted to their television screens and radios, anxious to hear the latest news, involved on the edge as if it were their own lives that were at stake. The rest is history. The war was fought and won. It lasted a mere 6 days, one of the most spectacular victories in modern history. We could celebrate and breathe safely again. Life went back to normal. But not completely. For I had witnessed something in those days and weeks that didn't make sense in the rest of my world. It had nothing to do with politics or war or even prayer. It had to do with Jewish identity. Collectively, the Jewish people had looked in the mirror and said, "We are still Jews." And by that they meant more than a private declaration of faith, religion in the conventional sense of the word. It meant that they felt part of a people, involved in its fate, implicated in its destiny, caught up in its tragedy, exhilarated by its survival. I had felt it. So had every other Jew I knew. Rabbi Sacks then asks why, especially since the Israelis were not people he knew and he'd only been to Israel once. It was then, he said, that I knew that being Jewish was not something private and personal, but something collective and historical. It meant being part of an extended family, many of whose members I did not know, but to whom I nonetheless felt connected by bonds of kinship and responsibility. Rabbi Sacks then notes that this made no sense at all in the concepts and categories of the 1960s. But he also noted that Jewish identity was not simply a truth or set of truths that he could accept or reject, nor a preference he could express or disavow. It was not even a faith he could adopt or leave alone. I had not chosen it, he said. It had chosen me. Everything which he was studying in modern philosophy, everything he said he experienced in contemporary culture, told him otherwise. But what he had experienced here was something that he was born into. Even though logically it didn't add up, psychologically it did. Without any conscious decision, he concludes, I was reminded that merely by being born into the Jewish people, I was enmeshed in a network of relationships that connected me to other people, other places, other times. I belonged to a people, and being part of a people, I belonged. That ending is particularly significant. I belonged to a people, and being part of a people, I belonged. The catalyst for this was Israel's victory, and perhaps most significantly, the reunification of Jerusalem. Rabbi Sacks' words were a beautiful expression of one of our most famous religious texts about Jerusalem, which forms a backdrop to his teachings about that holy city. Psalm 122, which he used as source material in Radical Then, Radical Now, and elsewhere. In Rabbi Sacks' Green Siddur, the authorized daily prayer book, it's on page 510, and the version in the Koren Sacks Siddur appears on your screen. Let's read the text with Rabbi Sacks' translation, verse by verse, and understand the impact of this psalm. Shir HaMa'alot LeDavid, Samachti B'Omrim Li, Beit Adonai Nelech. A psalm of ascents of David. I rejoiced when they said to me, let us go up to the house of the Lord. Omedot hayu ragleinu b'sharayich Yerushalayim. Our feet stood within your gates, Jerusalem. Yerushalayim habenuya ke'ir shechubara lah yachdav. Jerusalem built as a city joined together. Shesham alu shevatim, shivtei ya edut l'Yisrael, lehodot l'shem Adonai. There the tribes went up, the tribes of the Lord, as a testimony to Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. Ki shama yashavu chisot lemishpat, kisot leveit David. For there the thrones of justice are set, the thrones of the house of David. Sha'alu shalom Yerushalayim, yishlayu ohavayich. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you prosper. Yehi shalom b'cheilech, shalva b'armanotayich. May there be peace within your ramparts, tranquility in your citadels. Lema'an achai v're'ai, adabrana shalom bach. For the sake of my brothers and friends I shall say, peace be within you. Lema'an beit Adonai Eloheinu, avaksha tov lach. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I shall seek your good. Many famous words in this psalm as part of our liturgy and because it's such a famous psalm. Let's examine it in a little bit more depth and see how it relates to Rabbi Sacks' teachings about Jerusalem. This psalm is on the face of it about going to the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. Yet it is ascribed to King David, who lived before the temple was built. Even more than that, King David passed away before the temple was built by his son Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. Both Rashi and Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, medieval rabbis who wrote two of our foremost rabbinic commentaries on the Tanakh, on the Hebrew Bible, view this psalm as expressing King David's hope for the temple to be built, his longing for the temple, and for people to come there to rejoice and serve God, even though King David knew that he would not live to see it. Isn't that remarkable? Greater than his own sense of accomplishment and his own sense of experience was what he wanted for the Jewish people and as a servant of God. As Rabbi Sacks notes in his own commentary to this psalm, his commentary to the Siddur, King David's words were to be sung by Jews on their way to visit the Beit HaMikdash, on Pesach, Shavuot and Sukkot in particular, walking and singing together, belonging to the Jewish people, going to the temple in Jerusalem. This explanation at the start of our psalm shows the effect of Jerusalem to bring people together in simcha, in joy and in peace, through the holiness of the city as expressed at the temple and on the way to visiting the temple. Rabbi Sacks expressed this sentiment in his writings about Jerusalem in his work Future Tense, published in 2009. These writings are also available on his website, and they show how we today should also try to replicate the feeling of those Jews who went to the temple when we are blessed enough to be in Jerusalem. Let me show you an extract of Rabbi Sacks' words from that passage. Never did God love a people more, and never were a people more loyal than our ancestors, who endured 20 centuries of exile and persecution, so that their children, or grandchildren, or great-grandchildren could come home to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Ir HaKodesh, the holy city, the home of the Jewish heart. When we visit Jerusalem today and see a place of such beauty, it takes your breath away. Jerusalem is the place where all the prayers of all the Jews across all the centuries and from all the continents meet and take flight on their way to heaven. It is the place where you feel brushed by the wings of the Shekhinah, the divine presence. We have had the privilege to be born in a generation that has seen Jerusalem reunited and rebuilt. We have seen the Jewish people come home. We get a sense from Rabbi Sacks' words not just of the privilege which we have to be living in our times, but how Jerusalem is the place where we have that sense of belonging. The psalm goes on to tell us that our feet stood together within your gates, Jerusalem. And then the next verse, which immediately follows on, amplifies this theme. It describes Jerusalem built as a city joined together. That's where the tribes went up to, the tribes of the Lord, as a testimony to God, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. Rashi, once again in his commentary, links this psalm not just to the Jews who went to the temple, but those Jews who went previously to the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which was a precursor to the temple and had its final location in Shiloh. As they went to Shiloh, they would so too come to Jerusalem. Rabbi David Kimchi, known by the acronym Radak, another medieval commentator, expands on Rashi's theme. The Jews in exile, he explains, would remember and praise Jerusalem and the temple. When the Jews went there united on Pesach, Shavuot and Sukkot, they would say, "Who had seen a city like it?" We, of course, are Jews in exile. We, of course, recall what Jerusalem must have been like during temple times, and how much more so those Jews who live in Jerusalem and are able to visit it frequently can have the privilege of seeing the city of Jerusalem. So the message of the Radak, which Rabbi Sacks expands on, is that the feeling of those pilgrims going to Jerusalem in temple times is one that we should try and replicate to the best of our ability today when we are privileged to be in Jerusalem. In the continuation of that future tense chapter, Rabbi Sacks' words bear this out. 26 centuries ago, the prophet Jeremiah said that a time would come when we would not thank God for bringing us out of Egypt, but rather for bringing our people together from all the lands of the earth. This second Exodus Jeremiah described would be even more miraculous than the first. We lived to see this day, when Jews from 103 countries, speaking 82 languages, came to Israel to build not just their lives, but the Jewish homeland. After generations, it was Jerusalem that brought Jews together from all over the world as one people, in one voice, singing one song. There are some wonderful illustrations of this in Rabbi Sacks' work. The first I'd like to share with you is from a story he tells from 1991, during his time living and studying in Israel during the First Gulf War. He told it in many places, and he also wrote it in the Jewish Chronicle of that time, on January the 25th, 1991. Of course, some of you will recall, some of you will have read or learned about how Israel was attacked by Iraq unprovoked during that war, and Scud missiles were aimed at Israel. Here's how Rabbi Sacks describes that particular time in Jerusalem in an article called Solidarity on the Shabbat of the Gas Masks. The scene: Friday night in Jerusalem. Our little minyan in Yamin Moshe had gathered as usual to welcome the incoming Shabbat. There was only one sign that this was no ordinary Shabbat. Everyone had come carrying gas masks. Then there were 3 air raid warnings and a missile attack on Tel Aviv. The chief rabbinate had given permission for radios to be kept on throughout Shabbat, and 3 times we had followed the broadcast instructions. Gather the family into a sealed room, make the door airtight, put on the gas masks, and wait. The next morning we were told over the radio to stay indoors for fear of further attacks. I ventured out to the synagogue, curious to see if anyone had turned out nonetheless. They had. The Jerusalemites were not about to let Saddam Hussein spoil their Shabbat. Rabbi Sacks describes further on in the article what the difficulties were, particularly for children in school and at home, and the trauma which they suffered from. He then said as follows: there have been, though, some unforgettable moments. In the weeks before the war, Israelis had been depressed by the sight of empty hotels and departing visitors. Against that, the arrival of a plane bringing 400 Yeshiva University students from America, specifically to be here at a time of war, made a tremendous impression. The evening they arrived, we held a gathering of some 200 British and French students. Parents flew out to be with their children. Children came to be with their parents. One friend of ours, a rabbi in New York, came to Israel simply to be with the members of his congregation who were here. Everyone who came, or simply stayed, added something to the country's morale in troubled times. Then there was the stunning fact that throughout the sirens and falling missiles, Soviet immigrants continued to arrive, some 2,000 in the first few days of the war. And then there was the vast gathering a week ago at the Kotel, when almost the entire yeshiva population came together in their tens of thousands to pray for peace. All the tensions and rivalries which have marred Israel's religious life fell away in an echoing chorus of prayer. Perhaps only at moments of crisis do we catch a glimpse of how truly united the Jewish people is. In 2000, Rabbi Sacks participated in a conference on Jewish culture and identity at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His speech was also published in the Jewish Chronicle in the week before Yom Yerushalayim. Concerned at splits in the Jewish world at that time, he warned of the dangers which Jewish teachings and our history tell us about unnecessary disagreement, when we cannot find a way of belonging and being together as much as possible. His conclusion, especially bearing in mind he was speaking in Jerusalem just prior to Yom Yerushalayim, was telling. And to the extremists on both sides, I say, you diminish us and demean yourselves. Stop playing games with a small, vulnerable, but still majestic people who have much yet to achieve for ourselves and the moral future of mankind. Jerusalem, Ke'ir Shechubar Ala Yachdav, a city as if it were built together, with the Jewish people building it and building themselves together. Returning to our psalm, Rashi explains that the testimony, the Edut, which is referred to in the verse which we most recently cited, is directed at those who would deny our claim to the land of Israel and to Jerusalem. By going to Jerusalem, by giving thanks to God, we demonstrate our national claim. By it being part of our history, part of our sacred texts, it is there forever, even if we are not in Jerusalem. The Malbim, the great 19th century commentary, written by Rabbi Meir Leibush, goes further, explaining that the gathering of the nation together in Jerusalem is to thank God and shows the internal national strength which binds us together like the limbs of our body. As Rabbi Sacks referred to in that extract from Radical Then, Radical Now in 1967, it wasn't something that we can explain, but it's there. It's not something we chose, it's something we are born into. And when we attach ourselves to it, when we help others attach themselves to it, we all belong. Another story Rabbi Sacks told also brings this to life. It also occurred during the period that he was living in Israel in 1991, in the middle of the First Gulf War. Towards the end of the war, one late Shabbat afternoon in Yamin Moshe, he and Lady Elaine heard beautiful music coming from one of the houses a few doors away. We went to see what was happening and found a group of Romanian Jews, a choir who had just made Aliyah that week during the Gulf War. Soon it seemed as though all the residents of Yamin Moshe had been drawn to the sound. People who had come to Jerusalem from all four corners of the world: America, Canada, Australia, South Africa, Eastern Europe, and Arab lands. They all came together with that sense of belonging. As I mentioned before, do look at the work of Dr. Rose and Rabbi Sacks' team for further insights and discussion points on this beautiful, inspiring story. Rabbi Sacks notes, again back in Gateway of Hope, that whenever Jews remembered Jerusalem, something good came of it. But whenever they forgot Jerusalem, bad things happened. You can find that extract on his website as well. And of course, we know, looking through Jewish history, that we have many practices. For instance, one of the reasons associated with breaking a glass at a wedding, or not fully decorating one's house, to help us remember Jerusalem, and to make sure that Jerusalem in Israel is always part of our national memory, our collective memory. We should never forget it. and if we do forget it, it's at our peril. The psalm, of course, ends with a prayer for peace and good. In his commentary, Rabbi Sacks compares the sounds of the word shalom to the phrase or the part of shalayim in Yerushalayim. Shalom and shalayim. Rabbi Sacks says, style mirrors substance. The two words, of course, are connected. The gentle, soothing sounds evoke Jerusalem at peace. Another link to Oseh Shalom B'Romav, that signature, a song of Rabbi Sacks, prayer of Rabbi Sacks, which we heard at the beginning. We began by looking at Rabbi Sacks' words in Radical Then, Radical Now. We will wrap up by returning to that book. On page 183, Rabbi Sacks describes one of the reasons that he feels the Jewish people have endured, and one of the reasons that we have to feel a sense of connection to the Jewish people and of course to the Torah and to our religion, by reflecting on Jerusalem and Israel. After the Holocaust, a ravaged, devastated people came back to the land of Israel, and there built one of the great states of the modern world. Out of the wilderness they built farms and forests. In place of the totalitarian states from which many of them came, they framed a democracy. From a small population, they created an army of invincible courage. In place of Jerusalem, in mourning and in ruins, as described in Megillat Eicha in Lamentations, they created a Jerusalem built, as described in Psalm 122, as a city that is closely joined together. They made the Hebrew language, the language of the Bible, live again. They built yeshivot, citadels of Jewish learning, so that the streets of Jerusalem would again echo with the sound of ancient learning. They brought Jewish communities threatened by persecution to safety. Together, they brought about the collective resurrection of Jewish life, of the Jewish people, from the shadow of death to the land of life. Today, when Jews sing of Israel, of course in Hatikvah, they say, Od lo avodat tikvateinu. Our hope is not destroyed. In the final paragraph of this chapter, Rabbi Sacks closes with this. When I stand today in Jerusalem, or in a Jewish school, or see a Jewish couple under the wedding canopy, or see parents at the Shabbat table blessing their children, there are times when I am overcome with tears. Not in sadness, but in joy. But in awe, not in sadness nor in joy, but in awe at this people who came face to face with the angel of death and refused to give it a final victory. The Jewish people live and still bear witness to the living God. So we've seen how Psalm 122 underpins Rabbi Sacks' teachings about Jerusalem and Yom Yerushalayim. We've seen from that moment in 1967 how his teachings developed regarding Jerusalem and how the sense of belonging, it's part of our destiny. We didn't choose it, but it's who we are, and it's something which we can embrace and help others to embrace as well. Jerusalem is the city which binds us together, particularly through the temple and the teachings of the Torah which God gave us. If we can feel what it means to be part of Jerusalem, what it means to want to go to Jerusalem, to rejoice in Jerusalem, then please God, we will be blessed with the final redemption and the final full rebuilding of Jerusalem, b'mheira v'yameinu. As we close, let's hear from Rabbi Sacks in his own words. Thank you, and Yom Yerushalayim Sameach.
What's special about Jerusalem today is, despite all the tensions which are real, nonetheless, it's a place, the Holy of Holies, still to Jews. But also on the Temple Mount are two mosques. It's a place of prayer for Muslims. There in the Old City are some of the holiest churches in the whole of Christendom. So it is, nonetheless, a city of peace. One of the very few places in the Middle East, one of the very few places in the world, holy to three distinct faiths where those faiths pray together in freedom and in peace. And that's come only under Israeli rule in the last 50 years. Somebody once said about Israel, and you could certainly say this about Jerusalem, that it's not that long and it's not that wide, but it's very deep. So Jerusalem is very deep, and somehow within its relatively narrow confines, it contains, in Walt Whitman's phrase, multitudes. The other incredible thing about Jerusalem is that somehow magic happens with our sense of time. So, for instance, the walls of Jerusalem were destroyed by every conqueror and then rebuilt using the stones that had the previous walls. So if you look at the stones of the walls around Jerusalem, they come from all the eras, somehow past and present, the old and the new are all jumbled together. And then you think of this city, the oldest of the old, and yet Time magazine a couple of years ago listed Jerusalem as one of the top 5 in the world, which is an emerging center of high tech. So it's the oldest of the old and it's the newest of the new. It is the living symbol of what Theodor Herzl titled his book about the return to Zion, Alt Neuland, the old new land, the old new city for the old and renewed people.